I found out who the Rubber is, and hoo boy, does this rabbit hole go deep. For new Foundation staff members, I'm Dr. Theron Sherman, SCP author and creator of SCP podcasts, YouTube videos, and TikToks. Follow for more SCP content and community news. For background, The Rubber is a prominent SCP animation YouTube channel. With 1.8 million subscribers, The Rubber is a lot of people's first exposure to the works of the SCP Foundation. However, many longtime fans and SCP authors are not happy about that. The Rubber stands accused of churning out cheaply made, inaccurate accounts of what the SCP stories are, stealing art, and taking advantage of the YouTube algorithm in every dirty way solely for the money, artistic integrity be damned, to the detriment of other SCP artists. Do these accusations bear any weight? Let's look at the evidence. So who is The Rubber? It turns out The Rubber is not an independent artist, but instead a content farm under the business name Brainy Entertainment PLT, run out of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Here you can see their main channel, the Rubber mascot character front and center on the banner. They also run Chinese and Spanish language versions of the Rubber SCP, the Rubber Tunes where they shoved all the non-SCP Rubber content, and the channel Silver John where they make Friday Night Funkin' content. Guess we're not the only fandom they're mining for easy views. How nice. We also have job listings from Brainy Entertainment on Malaysian hiring sites. Someone on their LinkedIn equivalent saying, I worked at Brainy, both at Silver John and The Rubber. And if you go to BrainyEntertainment.com right now, their loading GIF is The Rubber. We are not looking at an individual artist here, we're looking at a content farm. Now, them being a company is not necessarily a bad thing. I myself am trying to build up Site42 Studios to make bigger projects, and I'm going to need a lot of people. The term content farm, however, does have a derogatory meaning when I say that this company is doing art the wrong way, both in making bad art and hurting the SCP community in the process. Please note that if you've enjoyed The Rubber in the past, currently do, or even will after I finish this video, I'm not saying you're a bad person. I enjoy cheap fast food from time to time. Plus, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. But after you hear out my reasons, I hope you'll at least understand my perspective, and even if you still enjoy what Brainy Entertainment is putting out, at least you'll also seek out other artists who actually care about the SCP community. Firstly, the company just does not care if they get the stories right. Sometimes they screw up important plot points so the story no longer makes sense, or they cut out the emotional arc of the story so there's no heart, just another spooky monster. Details are missed regularly. Characters' names are wrong, POC characters are whitewashed, LGBTQ characters are straight or cis-washed. Some may say that you're going to miss things when you're summarizing in a shorter format, but let's be real. I summarize these articles on frickin' TikTok. There's a difference between cutting things for time and getting things completely wrong. And erasing representation, whether purposefully or out of negligence, not okay either way. Next up, using non-SCP characters in their thumbnails and videos as clickbait. No, Freddy Fazbear and Attack on Titan are not SCPs. But if they were... No, stay on topic. I know, it's the internet. Every content creator clickbaits a little. But adding these algorithmically famous characters, whoever's hot right now, to SCP stories is low. And kinda shady when you remember that they're copyrighted and SCP is a Creative Commons community. Speaking of which, The Rubber was called out for not linking and crediting the original stories that they're making videos of, which is legally required in the SCP's Creative Commons license. Brainy Entertainment does not do social media for itself or The Rubber, and has not responded to any requests from the community to fix these issues, except for the licensing one, and that's probably because they could have been sued over that one. Overall, their frequent errors and lack of accountability show that they do not care what the SCP community itself thinks about them. You know, the people who make the free stories that they make their money adapting. On top of all that, their animation quality is just not that great. Compare with other YouTube animators like Jaden Animations and Odd One Is Out, and you'll see the vast difference in smoothness of motion. The teams animating The Rubber basically just stick a couple static pieces of art on screen and wiggle them around. Pixar the same. And when you look at their upload schedules, you can see why this is. Good animation takes a long time, it's a lot of hard work. Odd and Jaden take a month or two to put out a single video. Meanwhile, Brainy's teams are putting out one a week. And I'm just speculating here, I don't have any evidence, but looking at that release schedule, I'd be worried about what the employee conditions are like. Oh, and how could I forget the art theft? This is from The Rubber's SCP-076 video. It's not the only time that they copied a talented SCP artist's work, just the most blatant one that I had on hand. And the saddest part to me? They are admittedly one of the best SCP projects on YouTube if you don't think about it too hard. They've shaped how millions of people perceive SCP in a cheap and crummy way. Channels like mine, Dr. Sumerian, Volgan, SCP Illustrated, we can't compete with these big companies swooping in and doing SCP content. Lord Bung is the closest we indie artists have of this level of content making, and we've been waiting for episode 8 of Confinement for 2 years. It takes a lot of practice and work to make that kind of quality content, and when these companies swoop in and take all the search results and ad revenue and stuff like that, the people who actually care about the community's growth is stunted. Volgan has made art for numerous SCP articles. SCP Illustrated and Dr. Sumerian are collaborating on an original series in the SCP-001 When Day Breaks universe, approved by the author of When Day Breaks. I'm using my newfound TikTok fame to get live-action shows and films in the SCP universe made. We're all trying to work with the community to help it grow. Brainy started the Rubber 2 years ago. They made a variety of videos until they realized that SCP far outperformed anything else they made, so they focused in on us. SCP fans want high-quality SCP content, and Brainy wants money and nothing else. When a company makes a crappy movie adaptation of a film or a book we love, we get mad. We know a corporate cash grab when we see it, and now you see it too. I, for one, will not support Brainy Entertainment or the Rubber, or any content farm like them who disrespects and stunts the growth of the SCP community. If you like this content and want more of it, consider becoming a patron. Secure, contain, protect.